first of several recordings around an introduction to pregnancy testing in cattle. It was a series of workshops run by the Gascoyne Catchment Group by Dr Jess Shilling and Dr Kelsey Pool in July of 2025. The real question here, though, to scan or not to scan? A quick bit of background on Dr Jess Shilling and Dr Kelsey Pool. Jess is a cattle veterinarian based in Albany, running her own business under Bovitech Vet Services. She's pregnancy tested thousands of cattle using both the rectal palpation method and scanning ultrasound equipment. Kelsey is a lecturer and research fellow at the University of Western Australia with joint funding from the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. Kelsey frequently uses ultrasound in livestock, particularly in sheep, and also in a medical context as well. Now, before we crack into this introduction around preg testing, what we really wanted to emphasize here is that pregnancy testing cattle is not for everyone, and that's completely okay. Depending on how you're running your operation, what infrastructure you have, or even the kinds of information that you're interested in, pregnancy testing may just be a tool that you simply don't need to use. The main things that we wanted you to get out of these workshops were to know what options are available to you, to know what information you can get, and how you can actually use this reproductive data to make decisions around your operation. Knowing what infrastructure you need in place to make these decisions and how these decisions can change your production outcomes are both really important questions that you should delve into before committing to do a full pregnancy scanning test on your herd. Finally, it's also important to know who's qualified to pregnancy test cattle and whether or not you should be engaging with certain contractors. So for most southern systems, pregnancy testing is worth their while. In these systems, knowledge is power. Pregnancy testing, whether it be through rectal palpation or through ultrasound, lets us know who is going to calve and when. This can help us mitigate risks around breeder death, calf death, or failure to conceive in the next season. And it can allow the producer to separate calving groups and match certain groups to feed availability or to adjust supplementation. It can be particularly useful in knowing how many calves to expect ahead of time and allow producers to adjust their stocking rate relative to season. It may help us decide who to sell first, who to early wean, and how to manage paddocks based on things like ground cover. In terms of logistics, and can be a useful tool to knowing how many cattle roughly to expect for things like mustering and branding, and to also plan grazing rotations accordingly if that's something that's already within your operation. Importantly, and in most contexts, it's a really useful way of understanding where losses are. Are we losing calves during early embryo stages, for example, between scanning to bringing these animals in, or is this happening later in life? It can also be a useful way to know who to sell and when, particularly for these freeloaders or empties. Empty cows are essentially using up resources, they're increasing our stocking rate, but they're not being particularly useful for production outcomes. In the long term, pregnancy testing can be also used to shift the calving time and pattern. First round calves are generally worth more than second round calves simply because they've been on the ground longer and will be reaching weights at a shorter period of time. Pregnancy testing can actually be used to shift this calving pattern to push more into those first round calves, but you need to be realistic with this information. This is a long-term change and not likely something that's going to be happening in 1 year alone. In adjusting the composition of your herd, it can also be a useful way of kicking out your persistent empty cows. Fertility is a moderately heritable trait in most breeds, so knowing who has a calf and who's back in calf can be useful information to know who to retain within that herd. How you record your data, what you record, and your record keeping are all particularly important in the context of pregnancy scanning. There is no point doing all this unless you are going to be on top of that data and keep consistent records year after year. This should be for each individual animal and would typically include body condition score, the pregnancy stage, so trimester, not just pregnant or non-pregnant, the lactation status of animals, live weight, and potentially dentition if you're working with older animals. This data can then be used to compare not only year-by-year performance, but also cohort performance if that's something that you have within your operation. It can be particularly useful to compare, for example, between heifers versus your first calvers versus your mature cows, and to build this knowledge base over time to understand the influence of particular climatic conditions and seasons, as well as pasture availability. This data is not particularly useful if it's not accurate, and that really depends on the consistency of your data collection method and the accuracy of your pregnancy testing. Importantly, we really need to reiterate that pregnancy testing is not a silver bullet for increasing reproductive rate. It is simply a useful tool and useful feedback on your management. Jess will always emphasize that nutritional management is your number one priority. Bull management and disease management are also useful tools as well. Where pregnancy testing can be particularly useful is in the case of heifer management, because this can really set up how that animal performs from a reproductive standpoint for the rest of its lifetime. While mating 2-year-old cows generally results in quite good pregnancy rates, mating and yearlings can be a little bit more difficult. And this can be useful feedback from pregnancy scanning in terms of how these animals are performing on your country, what rates they need to hit before that pregnancy point, and what pregnancy rates to expect in those first few months. These first calvers are often indicator cows and can really highlight where nutritional management can be improved. If you're interested in the pros and cons of pregnancy testing, managing cow reproduction, and even how to use your pregnancy testing results, there's a few good resources over at Future Beef